October 1996, the shores of Lake Kivu, eastern Zaire. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang of impending rain. Along the jagged volcanic coast, the silence is not a sign of peace, but a vacuum waiting to be filled. Through the morning mist, low-slung wooden boats cut through the grey water. They carry men in mismatched fatigues, clutching Kalashnikovs with the practiced ease of those who have already looked into the abyss and survived. These are not just rebels, they are the vanguard of a continental shift. Suddenly, the silence shatters. The rhythmic thud of heavy machine guns erupts from the tree line. Traces arc across the water like dying stars. On the shore, a tall, gaunt figure stands motionless amidst the chaos. He is not a soldier of Zaire, but a commander from Rwanda, peering through binoculars at a dying empire. If the Zairean army had held the ridgelands that morning, if the aging dictator in Kinshasa had realized his border was not just being raided, but erased, the map of Africa might look very different today. But the response is sluggish, decayed by decades of corruption. The question remains, how did a localized border dispute transform into a conflagration that would draw in 9 nations and claim millions of lives? The First Congo War, Africa's World War, begins. The world in the mid-1990s was a place of tectonic geopolitical shifts. The Cold War had ended, leaving behind a vacuum where superpowers once dictated order. In Central Africa, this vacuum was a pressurized chamber. To understand the explosion, one must look at Zaire, a country the size of Western Europe, rich in cobalt, copper, and diamonds, yet hollowed out from within. Since 1965, Zaire had been the personal fiefdom of Mobutu Sese Seko. He was the quintessential Cold War autocrat, a man who wore leopard skin hats and built palaces in the jungle while his people starved. For decades, Washington and Paris viewed him as a bulwark against communism. But by 1996, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Mobutu's usefulness had expired. His health was failing, ravaged by prostate cancer. His army was a ghost, a force that existed primarily on payroll sheets to funnel money into the pockets of generals who hadn't seen a drill square in years. While Zaire rotted, its neighbor to the east, Rwanda, had just been forged in fire. The 1994 genocide against the Tutsi had left the country a graveyard, but it also produced the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF), a disciplined, battle-hardened military force. When the RPF seized power, 2 million Hutu refugees fled across the border into Zaire. Among them were the Interahamwe militias responsible for the 1994 genocide, operating from refugee camps. They turned the refugee camps of Goma and Bukavu into sovereign fortresses, launching raids back into Rwanda, intent on finishing what they started. Mobutu did nothing. He shielded the perpetrators. He played a dangerous game of ethnic politics to maintain his grip on the eastern provinces. He did not realize that by harboring the architects of the Rwandan genocide, he had signed the death warrant of his own regime. The war was not driven by ideology, but by survival and cold, calculated ambition. 3 men would decide the fate of the continent. First, Paul Kagame, the vice president and defense minister of Rwanda, a man of few words and absolute clinical precision. Kagame was a chess player in a region of brawlers. His objective was clear: dismantle the refugee camps, neutralize the Interahamwe, and secure Rwanda's borders at any cost. He knew that to do this he would have to destroy Mobutu. Second, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, an intellectual warrior who sought a new African renaissance. He viewed Mobutu as a relic of colonial-era kleptocracy that hindered African progress. Museveni provided the logistical backbone and the strategic depth for the coming storm. Finally, the man who would become the face of the rebellion, Laurent-Désiré Kabila, a professional revolutionary who had spent decades operating in the shadows of the Fizi Mountains. Even Che Guevara, who had fought alongside Kabila in the 1960s, dismissed him as more interested in women and alcohol than the revolution. Yet, in 1996, he was the perfect local face for a foreign-backed invasion. He was the Congolese veteran who could give the Rwandan-Ugandan intervention the veneer of a domestic uprising. This strategy was a masterpiece of deception and speed. Under the cover of a local Tutsi uprising, the Banyamulenge Rwandan Special Forces began infiltrating Zaire. They didn't just cross the border, they bypassed it. The geography of eastern Zaire is a nightmare for conventional armies. Dense rainforests, jagged mountains, and a complete lack of paved roads. But for the Rwandan Patriotic Army (RPA), this was an advantage. They moved on foot, often covering 40 to 50 kilometers a day through terrain deemed impassable. Intelligence operations were surgical. Rwandan agents had already subverted local Zairean commanders. When the shooting started, many Zairean units found their communications cut and their supply lines non-existent. The mobilization was not a massive buildup of tanks on a front line, but 1,000 points of light, small, highly mobile cells that struck at the heart of the refugee camps and the Zairean military outposts simultaneously. By October 24, 1996, the fiction of a local rebellion was discarded. The offensive began in earnest. The hour-by-hour collapse of the eastern frontier was a study in military decay. In Uvira, the Zairean armed forces FAS initially outnumbered the attackers. They had heavy artillery and armored cars. But as the first mortar rounds from the RPA began to fall, The FAS officers were the first to flee. They didn't just retreat. They commandeered civilian vehicles and looted their own towns on the way out. The tactical maneuver used by the Rwandan-backed forces was the enveloping pincer instead of attacking the refugee camps head-on, which would have resulted in high casualties among the RPA. They cut off the camps from the interior of Zaire. This forced the Hutu militias to either fight in the open or flee into the jungle. A turning point occurred at Goma. The Zairean army had promised a final stand. They had the topography in their favor, a high ground overlooking the lake. But the RPA utilized a psychological shift. They used long-range radio broadcasts to convince the Zairian troops that they were being surrounded by a force 5 times their actual size. Panic set in. Communication failed because the Zairian radio operators hadn't been paid in months and had sold their batteries for food. By the time the sun set over Lake Kivu, the invincible defenses of the east had evaporated. The Rwandan forces didn't stop to consolidate. They began a 2,000-kilometer sprint toward Kinshasa. The world watched in stunned silence as the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa collapsed like a house of cards. The casualty figures are difficult to quantify, not because of the fighting itself, but because of the silent killers that followed. As the refugee camps were dismantled, hundreds of thousands of people disappeared into the deep jungle of the Congo Basin. Tens of thousands died of cholera, exhaustion, and systematic massacres in the forest, a dark chapter that still haunts the region's memory. The political consequences were seismic. Mobutu, the leopard of Zaire, fled his capital in May 1997 as Kabila's forces approached. He died in exile in Morocco shortly after, unmourned and alone. Kabila declared himself president and renamed the country the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the treaty terms were never written down. There was no formal surrender. The victors Rwanda and Uganda expected to be the power behind the throne. Kabila, however, had his own ambitions. The alliance that won the war began to fracture the moment they entered the presidential palace. The strategic miscalculation made by the international community, and specifically by Mobutu's advisors, was the belief that the Congo's vast size was its greatest defense. They believed the jungle would swallow any invader. They failed to realize that in a state where the government provides nothing, the people have no reason to defend it. The critical mistake for Mobutu was his reliance on a mercenary strategy. In a desperate final move, he hired a group of Serbian and French mercenaries, the White Legion, to hold the city of Kinshasa. They had Me-24 Hind gunships and modern equipment, but they were fighting for a paycheck against men fighting for their lives. The mercenaries, seeing the chaos and the lack of support from the Zairean regular army, eventually abandoned their posts. Logistics didn't fail because of the terrain. They failed because of a lack of will. The First Congo War changed the nature of modern conflict. It introduced the African World War Madala conflict, where borders are irrelevant and non-state actors are more powerful than national armies. It saw the rise of mineral wealth as the primary fuel for warfare. The coltan in your smartphone became a reason for a village to be burned in the Kivu provinces. The military innovations were not technological, but structural. The use of light infantry that could operate for months without a traditional supply chain redefined what a modern army could do in the global south. Today, the echoes of 1996 are still heard. The M23 rebellion, the presence of Rwandan troops in the east, and the fragile state of the Congolese government are all direct descendants of that first march across the continent. The First Congo War was the moment Africa took its destiny, however bloody, into its own hands. It was the death of the colonial era strongman and the birth of a new, complex, and violent geopolitical reality. As the mists continue to roll off Lake Kivu, they hide the scars of a war that never truly ended, but merely changed shape. The ghosts of the jungle are still restless, and the lines drawn in the mud in 1996 remain the fault lines of a continent.